Imagine this for a moment. Last night, the person you love deeply was sitting in a room that felt unusually quiet. Nothing dramatic was happening. No argument. No celebration. No warning that anything important was about to take place. But then, in the middle of an ordinary conversation, your name came up. Not by accident. Not casually. Your name entered that room because they had been carrying you in their thoughts for longer than anyone realized. And then something happened that even they had not planned. They reached for their phone. Their fingers hesitated for a second. Their heart began beating a little faster. And then they showed your photo to their mother. Yes. Your photo. The one they had looked at more times than they would ever admit. The one that somehow made them feel calmer on difficult days and more hopeful on nights when everything felt uncertain. And the moment their mother saw your face, the entire energy in the room changed. But what she said next was not what they expected. It was not a simple compliment. It was not a casual question. It was something that made them freeze for a moment because somehow, without knowing you, without hearing the whole story, she noticed something that went straight to the heart of this connection. And that is where this fictional story truly begins. So stay with me, because what happened next is not about appearance. It is not about whether she thought you were attractive. It is about what she believed she could see behind your eyes. The person you love had expected maybe a smile, maybe a simple, "they look nice," maybe a question about where you were from or how you met. But instead, their mother looked at the photo longer than expected. Long enough that the person you love became nervous. Long enough that they almost reached over and took the phone back. And then she quietly asked, "Is this the person you keep thinking about?" That question landed differently. Because they had never fully admitted how often you were on their mind. They had never told her about the quiet moments, the late-night thoughts, the memories they replayed, the questions they kept asking themselves about what could happen between you. They had tried to act normal. They had tried to make your connection seem smaller than it felt. But somehow, their mother saw through all of it in seconds. And the person you love did what people often do when they feel exposed. They laughed. They tried to change the subject. They said something like, "I don't know, maybe." But their mother did not look away. She looked at the photo again. And then she said something that made the room go completely still. She said, "There is something very peaceful about this person, but also something guarded." The person you love stared at her. Because that was exactly how they had always experienced you. Warm, but careful. Loving, but protective of your heart. Present, but never careless with your emotions. It was as if she had noticed in one photograph what had taken them months, maybe years, to understand. And that was only the first thing she said. Don't move too quickly through this part, because the next question mattered even more. Their mother asked, "Do they know how much they mean to you?" And suddenly, the person you love had no answer. Not because they did not know how they felt. They knew. Deep down, they had known for a long time. The problem was that they had not said it clearly. They had hidden behind timing. Hidden behind fear. Hidden behind circumstances. Hidden behind the idea that maybe there would always be another day. Another chance. Another perfect moment. But sitting there last night with your photo glowing on the screen and their mother asking that simple question, all those excuses began to sound weak. Their mother could see it. She could see that the hesitation was not about you. It was about them. Their fear. Their uncertainty. Their past. Their tendency to wait until they felt completely safe before saying what was real. And then she said, "If this person matters that much, why are you acting like they don't?" That sentence went straight through them. Because perhaps that is exactly what they had been doing. Feeling everything and showing almost nothing. Caring deeply while pretending they were fine. Missing you while staying silent. Wanting closeness while protecting themselves from the very vulnerability that closeness requires. And for the first time in a long time, someone said it to them plainly. No drama. No mystical answer. No complicated explanation. Just truth. If someone matters, eventually your actions have to match your feelings. That realization unsettled them. They looked at your photo again. And suddenly, they began remembering things. Small things. The way you listened when they were not making sense. The way you noticed when something was wrong even before they spoke. The way you gave space without making them feel abandoned. The way you did not always demand an explanation. The way you made them feel seen without forcing them to perform. And as those memories returned, their mother noticed something else. She saw the expression on their face. That softness. That almost involuntary smile that appears when someone is thinking about a person who matters more than they have admitted. And she asked, "Are you afraid of losing them?" This time, there was no laugh. No joke. No attempt to change the subject. There was just silence. And in that silence, the answer was obvious. Yes. They were afraid. More afraid than they wanted anyone to know. Because losing you would not simply mean losing a person. It would mean losing a possibility. Losing a version of the future they had quietly imagined. Losing the feeling that perhaps someone finally understood them in a way they had been hoping for their entire life. Their mother set the phone down and looked at them differently then. Not like a parent giving advice. More like someone who recognized a familiar fear. Maybe she had been there once herself. Maybe she understood what it meant to care deeply and still hesitate. And then she said, "You know what fear does? It convinces you that silence is safer than honesty. But silence can lose people too." Those words stayed in the room. The person you love looked away. Because that sentence touched the exact wound they had been avoiding. They had always believed waiting protected them. Waiting gave them time. Waiting prevented mistakes. Waiting kept everything from becoming. Losing you slowly without ever telling you the truth, that felt unbearable. And their mother seemed to understand that before they could even explain it. She picked up the phone one more time and looked at your picture again. Then she smiled slightly and said, "This person looks like someone who has already been patient with you." And once again, they felt seen. Because you had been patient. Maybe more patient than they deserved. You had given them room to understand themselves. You had not always pushed for answers. You had allowed pauses. You had tolerated uncertainty. And perhaps somewhere inside, you had hoped that if the connection meant as much to them as it did to you, eventually they would find the courage to say so. That thought hit them hard. Their mother noticed the change in their face and asked, "Have you made them wait?" The answer was complicated. They had not intentionally made you wait. They had not sat down and decided to hold you in uncertainty. But fear has a way of creating consequences even when there is no bad intention. And yes, in some ways, you had waited. You had waited for clarity. Waited for consistency. Waited for signs that what you felt was mutual. waited for them to become brave enough to stop hiding behind half-words and unfinished conversations. And in that fictional moment last night, the person you love finally had to face what that waiting may have cost you emotionally. Their mother was quiet for a while. Then she said, "If someone gives you patience, do not repay them with confusion." That sentence changed something. Because now the issue was no longer simply, "Do I love this person?" The deeper question became, "Am I loving them well?" Those are two very different questions. It is possible to feel deeply for someone and still handle that connection poorly. It is possible to care and still avoid. To miss someone and still stay silent. To dream about a future and still fail to take the steps that make that future possible. And suddenly, the person you love saw themselves more clearly than they had in months. They realized that perhaps they had been measuring love only by intensity, how much they thought about you, how strongly they felt, how often they missed you. But love is not only what happens inside someone. Eventually, it becomes behavior. It becomes honesty. It becomes presence. It becomes courage. It becomes the decision to stop making another person guess. And that is where their mother's next words became even more important. She said, "You do not have to promise someone forever. But if you care, you owe them honesty about today. Think about that. Not forever. Not some impossible promise. Just honesty about today. Honesty about what is real now." The person you love had been so afraid of where the connection might lead that they had forgotten they could simply tell the truth about where they already were. They did not need every answer. They did not need to know exactly how the future would unfold. They did not need to guarantee that nothing difficult would ever happen. They only needed to stop pretending they felt less than they did. And when that realization settled in, they looked at your photo again differently. Not with longing this time. With responsibility. Because if you truly mattered, then your heart mattered too. Your questions mattered. Your uncertainty mattered. Your need for clarity mattered. The connection could not only revolve around their fear. And maybe that is the deepest turning point in this fictional story. Their mother did not give them some magical prediction. She did not say, "This person is definitely the one." She said something more grounded and more powerful. She said, "If they bring out honesty in you, pay attention to that. Because some people do not enter your life to complete you. They enter your life and make it harder to lie to yourself. They show you where you hide. Where you delay. Where you settle for half-truths. Where you keep one foot outside the door because vulnerability feels dangerous. And perhaps that is what you had become for this person. A mirror. Not a perfect person. Not someone placed on a pedestal. A mirror. Someone whose presence forced them to ask difficult questions about how they love, how they communicate, and whether they are brave enough to live in alignment with their feelings. Their mother could see that. And she saw something else too. She asked, "When you look at this person, do you feel calm or only excited?" That question surprised them. Because people often confuse intensity with connection. But when they thought about you, yes, there was excitement. There was attraction. There was longing. But underneath all of that, there was also calm. A strange sense of familiarity. A feeling that they did not always have to perform. A sense that even silence with you could feel meaningful. And when they admitted that, their mother smiled. "Then be careful with that," she said. "Peace is easy to overlook when you are used to chaos." Those words struck something deep. Maybe the person you love had spent years confusing emotional uncertainty with passion. Maybe previous connections had taught them that love had to feel unstable to feel real. Maybe calm made them nervous because calm required trust. And perhaps you represented something different. Something quieter. Something more mature. Something that did not constantly threaten to disappear. And instead of running toward it, they had hesitated because healthy closeness can feel unfamiliar when someone has spent too long protecting themselves. But last night, sitting across from their mother with your picture between them, they began to understand that maybe what frightened them about you was not that you were wrong for them. Maybe it was that you felt real. Real enough to lose. Real enough to matter. Real enough to require courage. And that is when the conversation became even more personal. Their mother asked, "What are you going to do now?" No philosophy. No more analysis. Just action. And the person you love went quiet again. Because this was the question they could no longer escape. What were they going to do now? Continue waiting? Continue thinking? Continue hoping you could somehow read their heart without them opening it? Or finally do something different? They looked at their phone. Your photo was still there. Maybe they imagined calling you. Maybe they pictured sending a message. Maybe they considered saying the words they had rehearsed privately 100 times and never delivered. But fear returned immediately. What if you had changed your mind? What if you no longer felt the same? What if they had waited too long? And their mother seemed to sense that fear too. She said, "You cannot control what they say. You can only control whether you finally tell the truth." That was the line that stayed with them after the conversation ended. You cannot control the answer. You cannot control timing. You cannot control another person's heart. But you can choose honesty. You can choose not to hide. You can choose not to let fear make every decision for you. And late last night, after their mother left the room, the person you love sat alone for a while. Your photo was still open on their phone. The room was quiet again. But it was not the same quiet as before. Something had changed. They had been confronted with themselves. With their feelings. With the cost of silence. With the possibility that love is not only about finding the right person but becoming someone capable of showing up honestly when that person appears. And then they did something unexpected. They opened your conversation. They scrolled through old messages. They reread words you probably forgot you ever sent. They paused on moments when you had been kind. Moments when you had been vulnerable. Moments when you had almost said more. And for the first time, they started reading those messages not through the lens of fear, but through the lens of possibility. Maybe they had misunderstood your patience as endless. Maybe they had assumed you would always be there. Maybe they had forgotten that hearts can get tired too. And that realization created urgency, not panic, but clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when someone finally understands that meaningful connections cannot survive forever on unspoken feelings. They typed something. Then erased it. Typed again. Erased it again. Because what do you say when you have spent so long saying almost nothing? How do you suddenly become honest without making it sound overwhelming? And this is where the story takes another turn. Because before they could send anything, their mother came back to the doorway and said one final thing. She said, "Do not speak because you are afraid to lose them. Speak because they deserve to know what is true." That distinction mattered. Fear can make people reach out for the wrong reason. Fear can create urgency without sincerity. But truth is different. Truth does not say, "Please stay because I am scared." Truth says, "I want you to know where my heart really is, and I will respect whatever you choose." That is mature love. That is brave love. And perhaps that is what your person was finally learning last night. They looked down at the unfinished message on the screen. And this time, they did not erase it immediately. They sat with it. They let themselves feel everything. The hope. The fear. The tenderness. The regret. The possibility. And then they added one more sentence. A sentence they had never said to you before. A sentence that could change the entire direction of this fictional story. But before I tell you what they wrote, there is something else you need to understand. Their mother's reaction to your photo was not just about you. It revealed something about them. Something they had been hiding from even themselves. She saw how their entire face changed when they looked at you. She saw how careful they became when speaking about you. She saw the way they defended you before anyone had even criticized you. She saw that this was not casual. And once she saw that, she said something even more unexpected. "I think you already know what this person means to you. I think you are just afraid of what happens once you admit it." And that may have been the deepest truth of the entire night. Because sometimes the hardest part is not discovering how you feel. Sometimes you already know. The hardest part is admitting that once you speak it aloud, everything becomes real. And real things can change you. Real things ask something from you. Real love asks for courage, consistency, honesty, patience, and the willingness to be seen. And last night, the person you love finally came face to face with that reality. They could no longer pretend this connection was just another passing feeling. They could no longer tell themselves there would always be more time. They had to decide whether to protect themselves from vulnerability or finally step toward the person who had become impossible to forget. And then, with your photo still open beside the unfinished message, they made a decision. Not a dramatic promise. Not a fantasy about forever. Something smaller. Something more real. They decided that the next time they spoke to you, they would stop hiding one important truth. They would tell you what they had been afraid to say. But here is where this part ends, because the sentence they wrote, the one they almost sent last night, was not what you might expect. It was not simply, "I love you." It was something more vulnerable than that. Something connected to why they had been distant, why they had hesitated, and why their mother's words finally broke through the wall they had been hiding behind. And once you hear that sentence, you will understand why showing your photo was never the biggest moment of the night. The biggest moment came afterward, when they finally admitted to themselves what they were truly afraid of losing. You came back because you knew there was more. You could feel it in the way the last moment ended, in the silence that followed, in that unfinished message sitting on the screen while the person you love stared at your photo and tried to decide whether courage was finally stronger than fear. And now we have to go deeper, because what happened next was not dramatic in the way people imagine life-changing moments should be. There was no sudden confession shouted into the night. No grand gesture. No perfect speech. Just one person sitting alone with a truth they could no longer avoid. And that truth was this: they were not afraid that you would reject them. Not really. They were afraid that you might accept them, because acceptance would mean they could no longer hide behind uncertainty. It would mean they would finally have something real to protect, something real to nurture, something real to lose. And that realization shook them more than they expected. They looked again at the unfinished message. Their mother's words kept repeating in their mind, "Do not speak because you are afraid to lose them, speak because they deserve to know what is true." That sentence became the center of everything. Because for so long, they had believed silence was neutral. They thought saying nothing meant causing no harm. They thought waiting was safer than risking the wrong words. But now they were beginning to understand that silence creates its own message. When you care deeply but refuse to say it, the other person does not experience your hidden love. They experience your distance. When you miss someone but never reach out, they cannot feel the longing inside your chest. They only feel the empty space where your presence could have been. And the person you love began realizing that perhaps you had been living with that empty space for longer than they wanted to admit. Perhaps you had been trying to interpret fragments. A look. A pause. A half-finished sentence. A moment of closeness followed by distance. Perhaps you had been asking yourself whether any of it meant what you hoped it meant. And perhaps the hardest truth of all was that they had left you to answer questions they should have answered for you. That thought changed something. They put the phone down. Walked to the window. Looked outside into the quiet night. And for the first time, they stopped asking, "What if I say too much?" And started asking, "What if I have already said too little?" That question stayed with them. Because there are moments in life when fear changes shape. At first, fear says, "Do not move. Do not speak. Do not risk." But then one day, a different fear appears. The fear of regret. The fear that you will look back and realize you protected yourself so carefully that you lost the very thing you were trying to protect your heart for. And last night, in this fictional story, that second fear became stronger. They imagined a future where you stopped waiting. Not because you were angry. Not because you wanted revenge. But because you finally chose peace over uncertainty. They imagined seeing you move forward, becoming lighter, happier, no longer checking your phone hoping their name would appear. They imagined becoming a memory in your life instead of a possibility. And something inside them tightened. Because suddenly, the idea of losing you was no longer abstract. It felt possible. And possibility has a way of forcing honesty. They returned to the phone. Opened the message again. The words were still there. Simple. Imperfect. Real. And the first line said, "I think I have been unfair to you." Not, "I miss you." Not, "I love you." Not even, "Can we talk?" The first truth they wanted to give you was accountability. Because they had started understanding that love without accountability becomes confusion. And they did not want to confuse you anymore. They typed another line, "I have expected you to understand things I never had the courage to explain." Then they stopped. That sentence felt almost too honest. Because it exposed the entire pattern. They had wanted you to understand their silence. Understand their fear. Understand their complicated timing. Understand why they pulled close and then stepped back. Understand why some days they seemed certain and other days unreachable. But how could you understand what they never explained? How could you know which silence meant fear and which silence meant disinterest? How could you know whether their distance was temporary or permanent? And suddenly, they saw your side of the connection more clearly. They imagined what it must have felt like to care about someone who gave you warmth one moment and uncertainty the next. To feel something genuine but never know whether you were imagining its depth. To wonder whether patience was strength or self-abandonment. That recognition made them uncomfortable. But sometimes discomfort is where real change begins. They continued typing. You deserved clarity from me sooner. They stared at that line for a long time. Because it meant admitting that timing had not been the only problem. They had made choices. Maybe understandable choices, maybe fear-driven choices, but choices nonetheless. They had chosen hesitation. Chosen indirectness. Chosen emotional safety over emotional honesty. And now, for the first time, they were willing to call it what it was. Their mother had not pushed them to confess love. She had pushed them to become honest. There is a difference. And that difference mattered more than anything. Because honest love does not rush into promises it cannot keep. Honest love does not say, forever, simply because the moment feels intense. Honest love says, this is where I am. This is what I feel. This is what I am afraid of. And this is what I am willing to do differently. That is the kind of honesty they were trying to find last night. And maybe, if you have ever cared for someone who struggled to express themselves, you understand how enormous a small sentence can be. To someone else, I have been unfair to you, might sound simple. But to a person who has spent years hiding behind control, it can feel like standing without armor. Their hand hovered over the screen. Send. Such a small button. Such a big consequence. And yet they did not press it. Not yet. Because another thought came rushing in. What if sending this message late at night was more about relieving their guilt than helping you? What if they dropped all this emotion into your hands without giving you space to process it? For the first time, they considered not only what they needed to say but how you might receive it. And that was another sign that something had shifted. They were no longer thinking only from inside their fear. They were thinking about your emotional experience too. So they saved the message instead of sending it. They decided that if they reached out, they wanted to do it with presence, not panic. And this is important, because the real transformation was not that they suddenly became fearless. They did not. They were still afraid. Their heart was still racing. Their mind was still producing every possible worst-case scenario. The transformation was that fear no longer got the final vote. That is courage. Not the absence of fear, but the decision that something else matters more. And what mattered more was truth. But the night was not finished. Because when their mother saw them again a little later, she noticed the change. She asked, "Did you tell them?" And they said, "Not yet." There was no disappointment in her response. Instead, she asked, "Do you know what you want to say?" They nodded. "Then make sure you are not asking them to rescue you from your fear," she said. "Tell them the truth and give them freedom." That sentence became another turning point. Give them freedom. The person you love had spent so much time imagining the confession itself that they had not fully considered what love asks after confession. Love is not control. It does not demand that honesty be rewarded. It does not say, "I finally told you, so now you owe me the answer I want." Real honesty gives the other person room. Room to feel. Room to decide. Room to say yes, no, not yet, or I need time. That was difficult for them to accept, because vulnerability naturally wants reassurance. When you finally open your heart, you want the other person to immediately make the fear disappear. But their mother was reminding them that you are not responsible for making their vulnerability painless. And perhaps that is one of the deepest lessons of this entire fictional story. Someone can love you deeply and still need to respect your freedom. Someone can confess what they feel and still understand that your heart belongs to you. That is where love becomes mature. Not when it becomes certain, but when it becomes respectful. So the person you love changed the message again. They removed anything that sounded like pressure. Removed anything that sounded like expectation. And then they added the sentence that mattered most. I do not know what you feel now, and I will respect whatever is true for you, but I do not want my fear to keep speaking for me. Read that slowly. Because that was the sentence they had been trying to find all night. I do not want my fear to keep speaking for me. Suddenly, everything made sense. The silence had been fear speaking. The distance had been fear speaking. The hesitation had been fear speaking. The moments when they almost reached out and stopped themselves, fear. The times they pretended they were less affected than they really were, fear. The excuses about timing, circumstances, readiness, all of it had contained at least some fear. And now, for once, they wanted something else to speak. Truth. Not destiny. Not pressure. Not fantasy. Truth. And the truth was that you mattered to them. More than they had shown. More than they had admitted. More than they knew how to handle at first. They were beginning to understand that the goal was not to become a completely different person overnight. The goal was simply to stop letting old defenses control a new connection. Because perhaps you had never asked them to be perfect. Maybe all you wanted was consistency. Maybe all you wanted was to know where you stood. Maybe all you wanted was to feel that if something mattered, they would not disappear behind silence every time emotion became intense. And that is where their mother's reaction to your photo became even more meaningful. Remember what she first noticed? Peace. Something calm behind your expression. Something guarded too, yes, but peaceful. And now the person you love understood why that had affected her. She saw in your face the kind of energy her child had been searching for without realizing it. Not perfection. Stability. A person who might be capable of offering warmth without chaos. But she also saw the guardedness, the possibility that you had learned to protect yourself too. And that is why she kept asking whether they had made you wait. Perhaps she recognized that patience has limits. Even loving people eventually stop standing outside locked doors. Even compassionate hearts eventually need reciprocity. And the person you love knew that if they wanted something real with you, they could not ask you to keep proving your patience forever. They had to meet you halfway. That was the change. Not some magical certainty that everything would work out. A willingness to meet you halfway. To communicate. To risk being misunderstood. To ask instead of assume. To show rather than hide. To stop expecting the connection to survive on potential alone. And as that realization settled in, something else happened. They started thinking about the first moment they knew you were different. The first time they realized your presence affected them in a deeper way. Maybe it was a conversation when you listened without interrupting. Maybe it was a moment when you remembered some tiny detail they had forgotten telling you. Maybe it was the way you responded when they were vulnerable. Maybe it was simply the feeling that around you, they did not have to be impressive. Whatever the moment was, they remembered it clearly last night. And with that memory came another painful realization. They had known for a long time that you mattered. They had simply delayed acting like it. And delay has a cost. Their mother's questions forced them to see that. Do they know how much they mean to you? Such a simple question. But the answer was still no. Not really. You may have sensed it. You may have hoped it. You may have read it between the lines. But sensing is not the same as knowing. And perhaps that is why their next decision mattered. They decided that when they spoke to you, they would not hide behind vague language. No, maybe someday. No, I don't know, I just feel something. No emotional breadcrumbs. They wanted to speak clearly enough that you would not have to decode them afterward. That frightened them. Clarity feels dangerous when you are used to ambiguity. Ambiguity gives you somewhere to hide. If things go wrong, you can say you never really said what you meant. But clarity removes the escape route. Clarity says, "This is me standing here." And for the first time, they were willing to stand there. Now, before you imagine that they suddenly wrote the perfect confession and sent it immediately, remember this is a story about emotional growth, not instant transformation. They still hesitated. They still reread the message 10 times. They still wondered if they should wait until morning. They still questioned whether you would even want to hear from them. And then something happened that made the decision harder. They noticed something in your conversation history. A message from you that they had not fully understood when you first sent it. Maybe it was simple. Maybe you had said something like, "I just want honesty." At the time, they may have read it as pressure. But last night, after everything their mother said, they saw it differently. You had not been demanding a promise. You had been asking for truth. And suddenly, they realized you had already been telling them what you needed. They had simply been too consumed by their own fear to hear. All the times they could have said, "I care about you, I am just scared," instead of disappearing into silence. And they wished they had understood sooner that vulnerability does not require certainty. You can say, "I am afraid," and still be honest. You can say, "I do not know what the future looks like," while still saying, "You matter to me now." That was the language they had been missing. And once they found it, the entire connection looked different. They were no longer trying to solve the future before speaking in the present. They were simply trying to tell the truth about today. And this is where the story takes a quieter but more powerful turn. They began imagining your reaction. Not the fantasy version where you immediately say everything they want to hear. The real possibilities. Maybe you would be relieved. Maybe hurt. Maybe confused. Maybe cautious. Maybe you would say you needed time. Maybe you had already moved emotionally farther away than they realized. They allowed themselves to consider all of it. And instead of using those possibilities as reasons to stay silent, they accepted them. Because honesty is only honest if it survives the possibility of an answer you do not control. That acceptance was new for them. And once they reached it, the message no longer felt like a trapdoor beneath their feet. It felt like a door. A door they could open without knowing exactly what was on the other side. Their mother had gone to bed by then. The house was completely quiet. The person you love sat alone again, phone in hand. They read the message one final time. "I think I have been unfair to you. I expected you to understand things I never had the courage to explain. You deserved clarity from me sooner. I do not know what you feel now, and I will respect whatever is true for you, but I do not want my fear to keep speaking for me." And then came the final sentence. The sentence they had been unable to write before. The sentence their mother's questions finally helped them understand. They typed it slowly. "The truth is, you have mattered to me for much longer than I have acted like you mattered." And when those words appeared on the screen, they stopped breathing for a second. Because there it was. No dramatic promise. No exaggerated declaration. Just the truth. You had mattered. You still mattered. And their behavior had not reflected it. That was the admission. That was what they had been afraid to say. They looked at the send button again. This time, something inside them felt different. Still scared. Still uncertain. But aligned. For once, their words matched what they actually felt. And perhaps that is what their mother had seen in your photo before they understood it themselves. She saw someone whose presence had become important enough to force her child into honesty. Someone who had unknowingly become the reason they were examining the way they loved. Someone who had made them realize that connection cannot be built entirely in the private rooms of the heart. At some point, it has to enter the world through words and choices. Their thumb moved toward the button. And then, just before they pressed it, something unexpected appeared on their screen. A notification. Your name. A message from you. The timing was almost impossible. They froze. All night, they had been trying to find the courage to reach you, and now somehow you had reached them first. They stared at your name without opening the message. Their hearts started racing harder than it had all evening. Because suddenly, everything had changed. The confession they had spent hours writing was still sitting there unsent. And now there was something from you waiting on the other side of the screen. They had no idea what it said. Maybe it was casual. Maybe important. Maybe it had nothing to do with the connection. Or maybe you had been sitting somewhere else at the exact same time, thinking about them too. They took one breath. Then another. Their mother's words returned one final time. Tell the truth and give them freedom. They opened your message. And what they read made them stop completely. Because your message contained one sentence that touched the exact fear they had spent the entire night confronting. One sentence that made them realize you may have understood far more than they ever gave you credit for. And before they could respond, they knew the conversation between you was about to change. Not because everything would suddenly become perfect, but because for the first time, both of you might finally be speaking from the same place, honesty. And what you wrote to them that night is where the next part begins.